we're really entering an era of technological anxiety about, how much the rate at which technology is changing is actually reducing opportunity. And this is, as I will say in a minute, this has been a long-running discussion. I mean, there's hundreds of years of discussion on this topic. It's nothing new, but it comes back into vogue at various points. And it's not hard to convince yourself, if you look around, that we're sort of entering the PC era of workplace robotics, right? Remember, the PC era starts in basically the early 1980s, when computers go from being, very expensive pieces of equipment that were very specialized, only owned by large corporations and research centers, to things that just became cheap and ubiquitous. So I'm going to try to make 5 points. One, I'm going to give some reasons why people have this concern about sort of this displacement of labor by automation. 2, I'm going to give some history of this idea and the concerns and how they've been resolved. Then I'm going to talk about one view, which is not about lack of jobs, but not the right type of jobs, and how that is something we certainly have seen a lot of. Then I'm going to talk about, the lump of labor fallacy, how people have traditionally understood it and what it leaves out, and I'll define terms in a minute. And then in the final part, I'm really just going to ruminate. I do not claim to have the answer. Do not feel like I will walk away, saying it's all going to be this way or that way. You can be reassured or you should be terrified. I will say that I'm uncertain. And so the question will be, is the challenge that we face one of scarcity, which is the economic hardship that we've always faced, or one of abundance, where all of a sudden we have too much of something that, we are so productive in so many activities that somehow we actually have surplus labor, something we've never really had. Okay, so the case for concern. So, one of the many exhibits in the case for concern is the declining labor share of value added in a large set of countries now. So this is from Karabubonis and Neiman. This is the 4 largest economies they look at, and you can see over the last 20 years, and many cases over the last decade, the fraction of all income generated by corporations being paid to workers has been declining, often on the order of 5-7 percentage points. And that seems like a reasonably robust fact at this point, and that's a surprise. It used to be believed that that there was sort of the labor share was constant at 0.7. In fact, historically that's not true. It has fluctuated over time, but it's been stable in the post-war period, which is actually quite remarkable, because if you look across industries, for example, it varies hugely. It's much lower in manufacturing than it is in services. So the fact that it would stay at an average of 7 is itself quite remarkable. But it does appear to be declining, and so one argument that the argument that Karabubonis and Neiman offer is they say, well, equipment prices have fallen, equipment has become so much more productive, firms are just substituting away from labor in general, right? And that can happen. So that means, even if productivity is rising, workers could get a smaller slice of an expanding pie, and there's nothing that says the slice has to, the slice can't shrink faster than the pie expands, right? A second thing that many people point to is declining employment to population rates. So here's the evidence for the U.S., and you can see, in 1974, 75% of U.S. males were working. At present, it's 65%. Now, that took a sharp drop in the last few years, but it's basically been trending down much this time. If you break this down by education group, it's much clearer. For women, had been rising throughout the course of the 20th century, but plateaued in the late 1990s and has not risen since. Canada doesn't look that different from the U.S. in this dimension. I was actually surprised. This is data from StatsCan. And also, declines in the male employment population rate on the order of almost 10 percentage points over this 30-year period, and also plateauing of female labor supply. I'm sure I'm not telling you something you don't already know. Another fact that people point to, so this is from the recent book by Brynjolfsson and McAfee, is a sort of, what they call the great decoupling between rising GDP and stagnant median wages. And I will come back to that at the end as well. So I'm not going to endorse that figure. I'm not even clear that sort of these GDP and productivity numbers are very reliable. But this is certainly, when you talk about the facts that get people very concerned, this is among them. Okay. So now let me talk a little bit about the history of this. So, there are many eras of technology anxiety, but the one that I think comes to mind for many people is the Luddites, who are 18th century weavers, and they were concerned about the invention of the power loom, which was a device for making textiles much more efficiently, but had the potential to displace their artisanal skills, and they responded by trashing the machines. And Luddite is a term that we've all heard. It's used in a derogatory way almost universally, although you can see their point at some level, maybe not the methods. But there have been more recent incarnations. So in 1964, the U.S. faced what was thought to be the automation crisis, and President Johnson established the Blue Ribbon National Commission on Technology, Automation, and Economic Progress, and a report issued by the U.S. Department of the Interior, of all things, which basically manages our national parks, said, "Leisure, thought by many to be the epitome of paradise, may well become the most perplexing problem of the future." And sort of one of the exhibits in there of their concern was the Milwaukee-Matic industrial machining tool of 1963, which was an early numerically controlled machine. It was not computerized, but it was a symbolic processor that worked on basically punch cards, punch tapes that program instructions, and it did. The picture doesn't look quite as awesome at this scale, but it did do a lot of stuff with just one guy with horn-rimmed glasses operating it, and a lab coat. Important that he had a lab coat. And so around this time, the ad hoc committee on the Triple Revolution. So what was the Triple Revolution? The Triple Revolution was the Cybernation Revolution, the weaponry revolution, and the human rights revolution, which involved some of the key members were Jacob Heilbroner, who's a very well-known economist, Linus Pauling, the geneticist or the biologist, and Gunnar Myrdal, the very well-known sociologist. And they wrote to President Johnson, "The traditional link between jobs and incomes is being broken. The economy of abundance can sustain all citizens in comfort and economic security, whether or not they engage in what is commonly reckoned as work." So they were very concerned that we were sort of approaching that precipice right then due to the rising productivity, in which there just wouldn't be sufficient labor demand, although there would be income being generated. The technological, the economic response to this set of concerns has always been sort of one to say, hey, technological change is a win-win. It's the only free lunch we can believe in, right? It's the thing that makes us wealthier. It makes everyone wealthier. We get benefits without costs. And then second, we would point to the so-called lump of labor fallacy for people who are worried about this. This is the Economist sort of online dictionary. One of the best-known fallacies in economics is the notion that there's a fixed amount of work to be done, a lump of labor, which can be shared out in different ways to create fewer or more jobs. And so the notion that we would run out of work to do, so if you sort of express this concern, you are falling victim to the lump of labor fallacy. And then if those first two arguments didn't convince you, we would just call you a Luddite. And hopefully that would shut you up. So that's been how economics has dealt with it, and I think most economists have had historically an extremely rosy view of that basically technology is Pareto improving, right? It's going to make everybody better off in addition to raising GDP more broadly, on average. Okay, so the record so far, of course, has been very positive, right? So if we look, for example, from look from 1901 to 2002, just in major U.S. cities, real incomes rose fivefold in that period, right? That's a rate of growth that basically has no precedent in world history, essentially, in the same period, for example, another measure of prosperity is the share of income given over to food, clothing, and housing, basically necessities. And that went from 85% down to about 55%, leaving the other 45% for smartphones and other consumer electronics. So that's good. And in this same period, in the same century, we've had rising employment rates across the board, right? There's not been a decline in male employment to any significant degree until the last, modestly in the last 30 years. Women's labor force participation was rising throughout up to the 2000s. And yes, people retired earlier and they didn't work 80-hour weeks in general, but we consider that a good thing. That was progress, right? That wasn't due to a lack of labor demand. That's due to rising prosperity. And In that period, in the last 170 years ago or so, we have undergone not, at least two, arguably three different technological revolutions, all of which had the potential to be hugely displacing of labor, right? So the first would be the Green Revolution, right? So in 1840, almost 70% of workers in the U.S. economy were working in agriculture. By the turn of the century, that was 40%. By the turn of the following century, that was 2%. And it would have been, and why did so many people leave agriculture? It was purely due to productivity increases, right? It was it was improvements in the farm, in plows, in tractors, and also, of course, fertilizers and crops and irrigation, all of which made farming just much less labor intensive. And it's not because we outsourced farming to China, right? In North America, we are, throughout, we're a big agricultural exporter. That was pure productivity growth displacing labor, right? And people worried about it, right? They worried about it at the time. They understood that something was changing. They did not understand what was going to replace it, but they did understand they needed to educate people, right? So the genesis of the high school movement in the United States that basically sent the U.S. population through high school at the, between 1900 and 1940 started in the farm states, not by accident, because they recognized that there was going to be fewer opportunities for their kids on farms. They needed to do something more. They sent them for an elite education, which was a high school degree, considered frivolous for most people at the time, and that was probably a good bet. As we moved out of agriculture, of course, we moved out into industry or manufacturing broadly. That has also declined. In the U.S., manufacturing employment basically peaked after the Second World War and has been in decline, sometimes more rapidly, sometimes less rapidly over the next 60 years. But we moved into services, and we never ran out of jobs, right? But it would have been very difficult for someone at the turn of the 20th century to recognize how much employment there would be in medicine and healthcare and transportation and hotels and food service and education itself. Right? And so there's always a challenge of trying to figure out what that next thing will be, because at the beginning of either of these revolutions, of the agricultural revolution, of the industrial revolution, or the move into services, you could have told this story, right? That we would be running out of work soon enough because it was hard to imagine what else people would do. Okay. So what has happened, in the most recent revolution, the sort of information technology revolution that's different again from the prior, is the creation of symbolic processing as a technology for accomplishing work. So this is, as probably many of you know, is the Jacquard loom of 1801, and it was arguably the first commercial computer in many ways. It was a symbolic processor, meaning it acted upon stored representations of information, stored in those punched brass cards, and they gave instructions to the loom to lift arms, to move threads, and so on. And so this was quite an elaborate device. There's a surviving example of a 10,000 card program by Jacquard, that the creator of the loom, that weaves a silk portrait of Jacquard. And the thing to notice about the Jacquard loom is that those holes are that's not a picture of the fabric, right? That's a sequence of instructions. The idea that you could specify information in any form and a machine could deterministically carry out that sequence of instructions once encoded symbolically is an extremely powerful idea, right? So it's the same idea that's actually in the Milwaukee-Matic, right? The Milwaukee-Matic is really, is just like the Jacquard loom, except it acts on heavier materials, and you have to wear a lab coat. And in fact, the Jacquard loom was also the inspiration for Herman Holroth, who invented the paper punch card, which was used to read the 1890 U.S. Census, first machine-read census, and then he paired up with Thomas Watson to form IBM. Now, what has changed a lot, of course, in the intervening years since the Jacquard loom was invented was an enormous decline in the cost of symbolic processing. So this figure is from a paper by Bill Nordhaus called 2 Centuries of Progress in Computing. And he tries to calculate the real labor cost of accomplishing 1 million standardized operations. So that's what MSOPS here is. Between 1850 and approximately 2007. And this is a logarithmic scale. So little declines are pretty significant in there. So from 1850 to about 1950, there's actually no progress in this. So it basically it's mostly labor. There's some manual things like abacuses and so on, abaci probably, and I should ask my daughter, studies Latin, but basically labor costs are rising, and so the actual cost of executing 1 million standardized operations has not changed. And then in 1950 or during the Second World War, we enter the sort of vacuum tube era of computing, and a lot of this is going on, for example, in the cracking of the Enigma code, the Turing machine, and so on. And prices start declining at a rate of about 20% a year, but it's from a very, very high level. And then we enter the transistor era. A transistor is just a solid state version of a vacuum tube. It's just a switch, but it's much more compact, it's much cheaper. And then the integrated circuit era, so we can put lots of transistors on a chip. And then finally the microprocessor era, where we can put millions of transistors on a single substrate. And the cost is declining after around in the 1980s about 30% a year. So so Nordhaus estimates that the real cost has fallen 2 trillion-fold in that period of time, which is impressive by any standard of progress. And so the consequence of that, of course, is that we've gotten very, very good at doing symbolic processing. In other words, carrying out recorded sequences of steps. So if we can specify a problem in a way that is sufficiently codified, that a sort of non-sentient machine can carry it out, we can do it really, really cheaply. What computer scientists and engineers had a huge amount of trouble automating are things that require non-trivial interactions between machinery and the physical world. So examples might be security guards, flight attendants, home health aides, people who wait tables, people who clean houses. All these things require visual adaptability, sightedness, locomotion in kind of not fully predictable environments, right? So the reason robotics is used in assembly lines but not in domestic applications is because you can control the environment, right? So Herb Simon, the economist, said environmental control is a substitute for flexibility, right? So on a factory floor, you can make a completely predictable environment where the robot has to be has to have an extremely limited set of adaptable capabilities, but you can't do that, or we've not historically been able to do that in other settings that are outside of that very rarefied environment. Okay, so if you look at these different groups of tasks, manual tasks, abstract tasks, routine tasks, the thing that's interesting about them is the manual tasks, these things that require this kind of very human flexibility, are done much more commonly by less educated workers and more educated workers. So when you think about in Western Canada, people involved in resource extraction, right? Many of them are doing these types of tasks, right? They're not primarily highly educated or trained tasks, but they require this adaptability, this working in an uncertain, highly variable environment. If we think about these abstract tasks, these things that involve creativity and problem solving and management, many of those are done disproportionately by the most educated workers. And then these routine tasks that involve codifiable activities historically are done by relatively middle skill workers, right? So if you think about clerical and operative positions, many of them are relatively codifiable, even though they're not the least educated occupations, right? It's that they use relatively formal procedures that we know how to script. So when we think about, and really I'm telling a story, I should say, about what the recent past, which is not necessarily completely accurate for the future, so I'm going to come to that in a minute. But when we think about what the implications of this have been over the last 30 years, one thing that we see in a lot of countries is something that looks like employment polarization. It's something that Nicole and Thomas have worked on, something that I've worked on. And this is sort of the growth of jobs at both ends of the spectrum at the expense of the middle. So on the right-hand side of these professional, managerial, technical occupations, these are the ones that make use of a lot of abstract tasks, right? That makes use of these things that we don't know how to automate, but are very complemented by availability of information technology. And those have been growing, and that's not a surprise. Everybody is aware of that. On the left-hand side, we have a lot of these things that make use of these non-trivial interactions with the physical world. So personal care, food cleaning service, protective service, and those are also growing. And those are jobs that are, you could say on the one hand, it's good, that's just work. There's abundance of jobs. In fact, a lot of the US job growth over the 2000s has been in the low end. However, when you think about those jobs, although there's high demand for them, the supply of people who can do those activities is very abundant, right? What, it's often said, why do the wages of barbers rise over time, even though barbers aren't becoming more productive, right? Or why do the wages of clerics, priests rise over time, even though sort of their bandwidth with the deity is not improving over time? And the argument would be, well, you have to compensate them for not doing something else that's becoming more productive, right? Well, so it's a question of what's their outside option. So for these jobs on the left side of this figure, there's many, many people that can do them. What regulates the supply of labor and ultimately wages in those set of activities is the scarcity of people who are willing to do them. And what determines that scarcity is what are their outside opportunities. So what you see in the middle of this figure is declining employment in office, clerical, administrative, and production jobs. The office, clerical, and administrative, that's very, very clearly coming from information technology directly. On the production jobs, and some of that is also coming from trade, right? But a lot, we see kind of downward mobility into that set from the middle down into this less attractive set of opportunities. So looking at this picture, you could say, well, the issue here is not lack of employment, right? It's the quality of employment. And so it's not that we've run out of jobs per se, but that the jobs that people have comparative advantage in are actually the ones that they don't like as much, right? So historically, technology has been about reducing drudgery, right? Reducing the role of physical labor in agriculture, getting people out of doors and into safe working conditions and doing things that are intellectually engaging, right? And this is an example potentially of displacing some of the work that's more attractive in terms of intellectual engagement and skill set, and having people do work that is is closer to, it doesn't use specialized knowledge. Okay, this pattern is not unique to the U.S. So this is work by Gu Salomons and Manning, and they just rank OECD countries, and this is over a short period. This is limited by data availability, and rank them by growth in the share of employment in low, middle, and high-skilled jobs. By high, they mean professional, technical, and managerial. By low, they mean these in-person services, and by middle, they mean clerical and technical positions. And what you can see, the red line corresponds to the change in the share in these middle skill positions. And in every one of these countries, you see a decline in the middle relative to the top. Now, I think there's somewhat more heterogeneity than that figure would suggest, but I think this is a pretty broadly shared phenomenon across a lot of advanced economies, this change in the composition of jobs. Okay, so now let's go back to the lump of labor fallacy. So that one takeaway from that is, so far at least, a lot of the change has not been about lack of jobs, but changes in the quality of jobs, the attributes of jobs that are not altogether favorable from many people's perspective. But the Luddites, I think that it's easy to see that they had a point. What the theory actually says is that technological change raises productivity, and hence it raises national income. It's not necessarily Pareto improving. Clearly, for the Luddites, right, for those weavers, right, their artisanal skills, which they had presumably spent a lot of years investing in, were devalued. So many people could then get cheaper cloth and so on. So it was welfare improving on an aggregate level, but it created significant displacement, and it can directly devalue skills. So workers can be directly displaced by machinery. Their scarce skills become not scarce, and more broadly, it means that the market clearing wage. There is, the theory says you can always use a productive asset, so labor will not be left idle, but the wage you might be willing to pay it would be quite low, could be quite low, right? So if people were if I wanted to have a job as someone who added columns of numbers, right, I might be able to be employed at that, but I wouldn't get paid much, right? Because what am I competing with? Okay, so this wage issue is something that there's I think, some reason for concern. So many of you are aware, in the U.S., of course, that we've had very stagnant wages for a long time, unless you happen to be very highly educated, right? So this shows you real wage changes for five education groups in the U.S. between 1963 and 2012. So the top line is those with a post-bachelor's degree. The orange line is a bachelor's degree. The green is some college. The red is a high school diploma, and the blue is high school dropouts. And you can see from kind of 64 to 73, everybody kind of rose together. Then from 73 to 1980, they all stagnated together, shared lack of prosperity. And then from there forward, things have really fanned out. And for most of those groups, there's been almost no progress over the last 30 years. And if you do the same picture for women, it's more encouraging. The whole figure is shifted upwards. But again, there's been, median wages for U.S. women have also grown very little. My understanding is that median wages for Canadians also grew very little, and especially so at the low end, in the prior to the current decade. And adding to this concern, is if you look at changes in labor force participation, right, you'll see in the U.S. in particular, and this data I know best, groups that have seen declining wages among workers have seen huge drop-offs in the rate at which they are employed. So this figure shows you, so the x-axis of this figure is changes in real wages for young workers between 1979 and 2008. The y-axis is changes in labor force participation rates. These are just males, and the symbols correspond to education levels greater than college, college grad, some college, high school grad, high school dropout, and then the different colors are race groups, so white, other non-white, and black. And you can see the very striking pattern. So, for example, among white high school graduates, their real wages have fallen by about 20 percentage points in this time period. Their labor force participation rates have fallen by about 12 percentage points. If you look at black high school graduates or black high school dropouts, the picture is substantially worse. Now, many would say it's not that there's no jobs, right? But the wages that are being offered, right, for the type of work those workers could do may not be sufficient to bring them into the labor force, right? So it's sort of not a case of running out of jobs per se, but it is a case where the market clearing wage for the work in which they have comparative advantage is now sufficiently low that it may not bring people into the labor force. And there are many maladies associated with that I'm sure I don't need to enumerate. Okay, so now that's a sort of a backwards-looking view, and so let me try to talk about my limited understanding of what comes next. So I will say, by the way, part of what I'm saying or trying to communicate is things that I've been informed by. At MIT we have a working group of sort of computer scientists and economists who get together to sort of talk about these issues, and basically the economists try to pump the computer scientists for information and pretend that we have secrets that we'll eventually reveal if they just hang out with us enough. And whereas our utility ran out after about an hour, but they know so much. So Frank Levy is a person who's arranged this, and I'm so impressed he's kept this going. So the question is the challenge scarcity or abundance, right? So the challenge we have always faced, that economics is fundamentally about, is scarcity, right? Unlimited wants, finite resources. How do you make the most of them? The concern about automation is the problem of abundance, right? That we have so much of some resource that the thing that was previously scarce, which was our labor, now becomes abundant. So let me walk you through this in three stages. So the first stage of computerization, the one that I really describe with this example, the Jacquard loom, is what computer scientists call the stage of simulation, right? Simulating a bomb. This is actually from the Manhattan Project in 1943. These women were called computers. They were the women who fed the columns of numbers and fed the punch cards into the machines. Simulating building a bomb, but also simulating doing a payroll, right? Simulating keeping books. It was all just simulating human activity of calculation. Okay. The second stage is what people would call intensive communications, right? So lots and lots of real-time communication between machines and people. So previously, most computer operation was batch process, right? It was done late at night when computer time was cheap. It was done, and it was not done interactively. So we've moved into an era of intensive communications where computing is with us all the time. We still interact with computers on their terms, right? But they are constantly providing us with information. The next frontier is one of engagement. non-trivial interactions between computers and the physical world. So just to give you a couple examples, this is one version of a self-driving car. On the right is Baxter, who you're all familiar with now. I bet you're all on your iPads right now ordering one. These are images from the DARPA Grand Robotics Challenge of 2013, which is ongoing. So the DARPA Challenge, so DARPA is the U.S. Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, and they have a very clever model of trying to stimulate lots of kind of immediately applicable research by offering prizes for challenges. So the first DARPA prize was to drive a vehicle across the Mojave Desert, unmanned, then was to drive one in something like an urban area. And now this challenge is actually inspired by the Fukushima disaster, was to have a robot that could basically drive up in a vehicle, get out, work its way across a set of concrete blocks, climb up a ladder, move a pile of wood out of the way, or wood, or anything else, and then pick a hose off the floor and attach it to a valve. Right? So the robot on the left, that's the Atlas robot. That's actually the robot fielded by the MIT team. It's right now walking across a field of concrete blocks. The one on the right is connecting the hose to the valve. Now, if you watch this, if you go to the DARPA website and look at these videos, you will be simultaneously impressed and dismayed. So the impressive thing is that they can sort of do this stuff. The amazing or dismaying thing is how far away they are from actually achieving this. So first of all, this all happens in snail's pace, right? So these robots walk, they have to plan each step. There's a huge amount of computation before a robot takes a step. The robots are all, the reason they cut the tops of these photographs off, the one on the left, is they're all hanging from cranes, because there's a good chance the robot will fall on any given step, and if it does, it might break. So it's hanging from a chain. The cables that you see, right, are power cables, because there's just not efficient enough energy storage, energy density, that you can put it on the robot, right? So the way we convert caloric energy into physical energy is remarkable, and there's nothing comparable. So battery technology is the big holdup there. So if you ever see one of these robots, it's actually self-powered. It has a big air compressor and an internal combustion engine. It's a horrible sight. And again, these robots are not autonomous in the conventional sense of the word. They're basically supervised and assisted, and there's a group of engineers who sit there on computer screens, and they help the robot plan its next step. So the idea of autonomy is you could, for example, point a robot to a ladder and say, get yourself to the ladder. Then you could say, now get yourself up to the first rung. And you would help the robot identify the next rung. And so the way DARPA does this, by the way, is you get to communicate with your robot, but they penalize you for all the data that you transmit, and they degrade the communication. The idea, if you're going into a reactor casing, there's a good chance you won't have high quality communication. And so they're trying to increase the likelihood that teams develop relatively more autonomous robots. So for example, the MIT robot, when it comes to a door, the operators look at and identify the type of door handle that is there. Then they instruct that to the robot. Then the robot is supposed to call up the software in which it figures out how to turn that door handle. Right now, in the MIT robot's case, they didn't recognize it was a windy day outside when this happened. So they pulled on the door, it didn't open correctly, robot fell over. It's a very, very long way, this non-trivial interactions. However, that is the frontier they're working on. And many of these are the tasks that I call the manual tasks, right? The things that, seemed 10 years ago to be a lifetime away, right? So my work, when we talked about this 10 years ago, we said robots won't be driving vehicles for a good long time, right? Because it requires too much rich interaction with the environment. Now, when you talk to people about the Google car, they have different views. Some will say, it's done. Others will say that the Google car is not driving. It's not driving a car. It's driving on a map. And if the world doesn't look like the map, the car has to stop. It can't make its own decisions. But clearly, they've made huge progress in this direction. So now let me come back to sort of where I started about this debate about the future of work. So Jacob Heilbroner, in The Public Interest in 1965, wrote, technology now threatens a whole new group of skills as machines continue to invade society, duplicating greater and greater numbers of social tasks. It is human labor itself, at least as we now think of labor, that is gradually rendered redundant. And he was talking about the simulation age. He was really talking about clerical tasks. So Herb Simon, who's one of my personal heroes, wrote in response in 1996, the world's problems in this generation and the next are problems of scarcity, not of intolerable abundance. The bogeyman of automation consumes worrying capacity that should be saved for real problems. And you can see what those were at that time. Now, so here's, just to see how far economists have come on worrying about this. So economists have always been the most optimistic about this scenario. So the Chicago Booth School does this survey of economists and asks them about their views on various policies. They actually asked me to write robots questions, and I have the preliminary results from these. These were sent last week. They didn't use the questions I wanted, but so the first question was, advancing automation has not historically reduced employment in the United States. So 64% of economists that they surveyed, there's 34 well-known economists. I admit I'm in here, so I strongly agreed. I'm one of the 24%. So clearly, there's almost near professional unanimity that historically automation has not reduced employment. So here, just to conclude, I'll try to conclude on a not too pessimistic a note, because I don't feel too pessimistic today. So I think there are three views of the problem, right? One is simply that we lack imagination. We're not seeing the thing like healthcare, software services, exotic vacations that have continued to produce demand for labor, long after we got automated the thing we used to be doing, right? A second problem is that we have a labor demand problem. We're just not gonna have things for people to do. There'll be many people who are just not employable at any meaningful wage. A third problem, it's closely related to second, is that we have an income distribution problem. That in fact, if we have all this great bounty, as Brynjolfsson and McAfee call in this book, that means that we have enormous advances in productivity, right? So clearly we're getting rich. It's just a question of how that income has been distributed. The basis of our economic system in countries like ours is labor scarcity. That's how we distribute income. People have scarce labor, they sell it to the market, they're well paid for it. If that labor became non-scarce, that would mean we were fabulously wealthy, but we would need to figure out how to distribute differently, right? And I think that's the potential challenge. So the worst case scenario that some people point to is they say, think of the example of horses, right? There's no competitive wage a horse can earn anymore, right? It just, when you combine the whole mess and the disease and so on, it's just like it can't compete with a internal combustion engine at every wage. And so we just have fewer horses. And so people say people will be like horses. Well, but the difference is that we own the machines. Horses didn't own the machines, right? So we get wealthy, unlike horses, when automobiles get better, right? So the question is, again, not of obsolescence of people, but distribution of resources, right? So historically, we have responded to this problem through skills. And that has always been, so, there was this Ken Burns series on PBS called, The National Parks, America's Best Idea. I would say America's best idea was education. Make it mass education, investing in the skills of the population. And certainly everything that we see says that the people who benefited the most are people with the most specialized skills and in terms of employment, in terms of earnings, and that is how we have historically responded to these changes. So if we were to take the labor force of the early 20th century and transport them to the present, right, there would be mass unemployment. They would not be able to operate the economy that we have. So it's hard to say that that is in any sense a complete solution to this challenge, but it's clearly part of that solution. Okay, I hope I didn't go on too long. Happy to take questions.
Okay.